Hello, everyone. I am Ruben Espinosa. I'm the director of the Arizona Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies at ASU. Thank you. That's adequately embarrassing me. So it's my pleasure to welcome you tonight to tonight's events, Revising the Humanities. I want to thank you all for coming and to thank those who are at home tuning in. And up front, I wanted to announce that Ayanna Thompson, unfortunately, could not make it tonight. She is undergoing chemotherapy for cancer treatment. And if you know Ayanna, it's only chemotherapy that would keep her from coming to something like this. So she sends her regrets, and we send her well wishes as she is at home tonight. So I want to open tonight with a story that's somewhat close to home for me, both geographically and also personally. In 2007, amid the passing of anti-immigrant legislation that essentially made racial profiling legal in Arizona, social activist Dolores Huerta spoke to an assembly of students, mostly Latinxes, at Tucson High School. With candor, she encouraged them to be confident in their voices and to vote because, in her words, Republicans hate Latinos. That infuriated Tom Horn, who at that time was a superintendent, who is now a superintendent in Phoenix, and he's also a staunch Republican. He organized a follow-up assembly and sent his aide to explain to the students that Republicans did not, in fact, hate Latinos. But as his aide spoke, a large group of students turned their backs on her and raised their fists in the air in protest. Most of these students were in the Mexican-American Studies program at Tucson High. And when Horn learned of this, he made it his mission to dismantle the program. And he did, through new legislation. This led to the infamous banned book controversy, only a controversy because one of the books that could no longer be taught in that program was William Shakespeare's The Tempest. What's heartbreaking for me about that incident is that following the dismantling of the Mexican-American Studies program, a University of Arizona study found that the program increased graduation rates and college enrollment for young Latinxes. The legislation that led to the book banning deliberately sought to stifle the success of these young Latinxes. I share this with you because these are the stakes in our current moment. It isn't about saving Shakespeare, and don't worry, we're not here to save Shakespeare, but it is about thinking through what engaging meaningfully and thoughtfully with the pre-modern past can offer our students and the future of the humanities. You see, the current litany of legislation against critical race theory is not altogether new, but it does feel like it has teeth at this moment. From our corner of the world at ACMRS, we feel poised to push back. Tonight, we will explore why, and we will explore how. We will also discuss Throughlines, a dynamic and groundbreaking digital platform featuring exciting expert pre-modern scholars. And we are fortunate to have 4 of them here tonight who will be in conversation with us. So it's my distinct pleasure to welcome our 4 panelists, and I'm not going to read their bios because we will be here for a long time. They are impressive, and you can find them on Throughlines.org. But starting from the left, my left, your right, we have Leslie Alexander, the Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Professor of History at Rutgers University. Dennis Britton, Associate Professor of English at the University of British Columbia. And Ian Smith, the Leo S. Bing Chair in English and American Literature and Professor of English at the University of Southern California. And Daniel Padilla Peralta, Associate Professor of Classics at Princeton University. Please join me in giving them a warm welcome. So we've asked our panelists tonight to prepare opening remarks, and we will go down the line to my left, starting with Danielle, giving a brief 5 minutes. After that, we will have a conversation among the panelists, and then open it up to questions and conversation with the audience.
Better. So thank you all so much for being here tonight. I am delighted to be joining my fellow panelists and Ruben, and I have to say that for me, it has been a source of no insubstantially small amount of agonizing to come up with remarks that can fit within 5 minutes. I will do my level best, and you will forgive me if I overstep. One of my responsibilities on campus is to make the case for the continuing relevance of the humanities, and to do so in a very specific context. I work with the Mellon Mays Undergraduate Fellowship Program on my campus, and as many of you will know, Mellon Mays identifies and supports undergraduates from historically minoritized groups who hope to pursue graduate study in the humanities and humanistic social sciences. The long-term aim of MMUF is to diversify the professoriate, and in that it has been phenomenally successful. As faculty coordinator for Mellon Mays on campus, one of my responsibilities this year has been to facilitate the transformation of our co-curricular model into a credit-bearing course. And so my colleague, Dr. Afia Ofori-Mensah, and I are teaching the first prong of that course, Histories and Theories of the Academic Humanities, this fall. Each week, the 10 junior and senior Mellon Fellows meet for a seminar that blends discussion of select readings with skill building and professionalization exercises. At our latest session on Wednesday, the discussion tackled two interlinked questions: what are the humanities, and why study them? See, we don't shy away from the big questions. We took it as points of departure William Drees's 2021 book, What Are the Humanities For clarity on definitions, and Ignacio Sanchez Prado's spirited 2023 essay in the Los Angeles Review of Books, The Humanities Are Worth Fighting for attunement to the fight over the future of humanistic study. Structured as it was around lively pieces, our discussion itself was very lively. But it became especially vibrant when several of the fellows raised questions about the ethics of studying cultural traditions that are not their own, or that they cannot claim as their own. While the example on several lips was of the white scholar turned appropriator or expropriator, familiar presence in these kinds of conversations, the ramifications of this line of inquiry extended well beyond this spectral presence. It seemed to me, sitting in quiet contemplation of the volleys being exchanged, that the question had a singular force for premodernists, who are not always inclined to look at their own work of cultural appropriation and expropriation with the same critical reflexivity of, say, anthropologists, for example. Almost compulsively, I tend to triangulate my way around these conversations by reference to other items read, and in some cases, these are items that are undergoing a seemingly sempiternal rumination in the guts of my mind. There were two that were very present for me at that Wednesday discussion, one item new and one item old. The first is a beautiful 2022 essay by Isaiah Lorado Wilner that appeared in the Journal of the History of Ideas, entitled Body Knowledge, Dance, Anthropology, and the Erasure of History, end quote. Wilner's essay makes a provocative and enormously compelling bid for resituating native, indigenous communities as movers and shakers in global intellectual history. And it does so by rereading an iconic moment in the visual record of early 20th century anthropology. It is a photograph of France Boas in the pose of the Hamatsa, a cannibal dancer of the Kwakwala-speaking peoples, that in the early 2000s came to be engraved on a prize medal of the American Anthropological Association. The selection of this photograph for the medal stirred controversy since, as Wilner explains, and I quote, "The sanctioned image of the discipline established by state peoples to record the lives of the non-state peoples they aim to erase depicted a Western scholar naturalizing the stereotype of indigenous violence," end quote. But Wilner proceeds to show that much more can be recovered from this image than merely and appropriately the self-justification of Western anthropology or the critique of its practitioners as cultural appropriators and expropriators. And I'll quote Wilner again. What we see is the story of Boas as a non-judgmental friend of his hosts, innocently joining in their behavioral pattern, a recurring motif of cultural relativism. What we do not see, what is framed out, is the history of violence the dance represented, answered, and redressed. Yet, as a remnant of the history that produced it, the image carries its past like an unseen residue, encoding the violence it obscures. This concentrate of erased origins can operate in the present as a memory capsule, a conceptual stimulus that can enter our bodies and infuse our minds with suppressed sensations, reactivating and converting silenced body knowledge. We can use this photograph as a memory capsule if we study it in the context of the dance that produced it rather than of the science that constructed it, end quote. Wilner's article is to me exemplary in at least two respects. First, it delivers on the promise of richly historicizing the knowledge that pulsates through documents of this sort, knowledge that is genuinely co-constituted by participants and observers of the dance. Second, and with more immediate relevance to the conversation that took place among the Mellon Fellows on Wednesday, as well as my own intervention tonight, it unmasks the master figure of the white male anthropologist as a vector for the transmission of knowledge that he himself only imperfectly grasps. Wilner is very clear about this point as it bears on the article's reconstruction of body knowledge. He proposes to trace, quote, a history of the ideas encoded in the Hamatsa dance, a process of transforming violence into nonviolence through movements of the body that converted the white man who copied the postures into a migrating medium of indigenous body knowledge, end quote. Without overgeneralizing Wilner's proposition, I'll submit for your consideration tonight the idea that in studying cultures that are not our own, we can become, and often unbeknownst to ourselves do become, migratory media. By invoking the notion of the scholar as a medium, I don't mean to suggest that the scholar-interpreter is purely passive or to put them forward as an inert and antiseptically polished vessel for the relay of culture. Marshall McLuhan taught generations that the medium is the message. I don't want to veer in the direction of that extreme, but it's useful to keep in mind one fact that's been hammered home by media studies, that the medium exerts decisive and lasting control over any content that it filters and routes. In linking Boaz's posture to the configuration of the global history of knowledge, Wilner arrives at the insight that specific forms of knowledge, as conduced through those bodies, can be activated to yield memories, and with them partially or fully occluded orientations to the world that exceed the conscious intentions of those who inhabit those bodies. The implications of this claim range beyond the Hamatsa, they range past the history of dance, and indeed I see these implications as ranging past Wilner's own active intentions with his article. The prospect of exceeding and eclipsing the intentions of the scholar-interpreter, Boaz, Wilner, brings me to the second text that came alive for me during our seminar conversation, and the text that has for a long time structured how I think about the responsibilities of the humanities and of pre-modernists working within the humanities. This is a text that trails a very differently tessellated set of associations, and it comes from Virgil's Aeneid. At a supercharged moment in Book 8 of this epic, the hero Aeneas contemplates the images on new armor that he has been gifted. In deliberate imitation of Homer's shield of Achilles' ekphrasis, Virgil has his mythic protagonist sport a shield that captures the full sweep of Rome's history, a history that will extend many centuries past the lifetime of Aeneas himself. Having made already clear in Book 6 of the epic that the knowledge of this future, which is briefly vouchsafed to Aeneas in the underworld, will not follow him back into conscious existence, Virgil stresses once again at the conclusion of Book 8 that even in beholding these images of events to come, Aeneas will not understand the history that he carries with him. Talia perclupeum vulcani dona parentis, mirator rerum quignoros imagine gaudet, atolens umero famam quet fata nepotem. Such things on the shield made by Vulcan, gifts of his parents, he admires, and ignorant of these matters, he rejoices in the image, bearing on his shoulder the renown and fates of his descendants. As is true for many Latinists and Roman historians, my relationship to the Aeneid is complicated, like those old Facebook statuses. It's not my favorite work of Virgil. I find the Georgics to be more aesthetically appealing, and partly for that reason, more unnerving. And the Aeneid's protagonist has always struck me as rather drab, with none of the tantrum-throwing flash of Achilles or malignant perseverance of Odysseus. While he shares with the latter the mythobiography of storm-tossed migrant agony, a suffering for which I can readily summon an elective affinity, on arriving at his final destination, Aeneas becomes embroiled in a settler-colonial process whose long-term resolution is nothing more and nothing less than the epistemicidal reordering of Italic cultures. Finally, the transmutation of the Aeneid into foundational epic of empire hits differently for me, originating as I do in an Afro-Caribbean universe where epic and empire joined forces in the decades after the first contact to broker the most violent of enterprises. But I turn to Aeneas now at the inspiration and instigation of Wilner, wondering if in the example of the hero carrying a shield emblazoned with unknown futures, we might find some metaphorical purchase for the labor of the humanities and for pre-modernists working in the humanities. This shield is the material expression of a future that exceeds the hero and exceeds us, not only on account of its magnitude, but on account of our own very limited capacity for cognition. Aeneas, like us, transports this future, even wields it as a defense, all while remaining insensate to the full depth of the knowledge of past, present, and future that is contained within it. This metaphor is in some respects more aggressive because more nakedly bellicose than the metaphor of the medium, but maybe we need to be about the struggle and fighting talk. Aeneas not only fights for the future, this is an interpretation that's well established among Virgilian scholars, but with the future as his instrument. The knowledge whose full significance will only become apparent to future generations is a resource for him in the struggle of this life. That he does not grasp that resource in its entirety is no disincentive for embracing it as armor. Thank you.
Hi everyone, good evening, good afternoon. When Rodrigo describes an unnamed black man as an extravagant and wheeling stranger of here and everywhere.
Sorry, can you put it up a little bit? And this is for the people at home. I will not interrupt you again.
When Rodrigo describes an unnamed black man as an extravagant and wheeling stranger of here and everywhere, he initiates a conversation about immigration, otherness, and the undesirability of a racially plural societies. After all, Othello, this black man, has been hired by the Venetian authorities as a contributing resident to shore up the state's national security. The efforts against the threatening imperial incursion. Drought and food insecurity have led to migration in East Africa from Ethiopia, Somalia, and South Sudan to Kenya. And the Irish famine of the 1840s and 50s brought 1.3 million persons to the United States. And financial insecurity, the hope for a better life, and various forms of internal conflict have prompted many of their arrivals at the U.S. southern border. But a false narrative about Haitians in Springfield, Ohio, has unleashed a spate of bomb threats and school closings to prevent children, exposing once more the white racial tribalism that would deny the humanity of black persons who are simply trying to live their lives and contribute to rebuilding a city that was in decline, a modern-day version of the Othello immigration story. I've used the expression deny the humanity of black persons. I have used the expression deny the humanity of black persons deliberately to bring together what I believe is at stake in today's discussion under the rubric revising the humanities. Denial has been the signature offensive strategy in much of the practice of Anglo-American humanism. Premodern critical race studies knows this firsthand, since the field's origins were enmeshed in the exhausting denials of the stern gatekeepers of humanism. The ironies are palpable, since that notion of humanism was insufficiently capacious to include racially diverse, non-white humans. It was, as many have argued, a white humanism. This correlation of denial and race extends beyond literary studies, but maintains its deep ties. From James Baldwin's sobering recognition that Americans would rather consciously ignore race to Ibram Kendi's blunt assessment that, quote, the heartbeat of America is denial, we understand that employing an inclusive critical race perspective threatens to destabilize the anodyne comforts of old humanism, to enable classrooms to engage in projects of revision. It is this dawning recognition that has turned banning books, policing public libraries, and scrubbing school curricula of black history into the latest iteration of the denial machine that would not only uphold old humanism, but press it further into the service of an anti-democratic political agenda that served white humanism, that cloaked itself in strategic silence and invisibility. Today, that invisibility is in retrenchment, and its most prominent voice has charged critical race theory with being, quote, anti-American. The delineation is overt and clear. Those who would teach critical race studies are to be divisively excluded, like the black residents of Springfield, with whom I began. Democracy requires mutuality, reciprocity, and shared access to rights, the very opposite of this careless, wrong-headed, and dangerous cry of anti-Americanism. Premodern critical race studies has always been invested in these democratic principles that today, at this moment, seem more vital and necessary than ever. Revising the humanities for our purposes means courageously, intrepidly continuing to examine texts, exploring the many ways that race as bridge building, race as a project in equity, race as inseparable from declaring our humanity, has been and will continue to be a critical part in revisioning our democratic future.
Good evening. Can everyone hear me? All right. Thank you to Ruben and to ASU and Ayanna Thompson for bringing us all together tonight and for this wonderful Throughlines project, which I am so excited to dig into for my own teaching. I don't feel qualified to talk about the future of the humanities, nor do I like talking about the future because it feels kind of like prophecy or something, but here we go. When I think of the future of the humanities, to some extent, I believe that the future, our future, is rooted in what has traditionally been understood as the goal of the humanities, to understand the human. But of course, the category of the human is understandably vexed. Both history and our present moment make it clear that not all Homo sapiens are included within this conception or in historical conceptions of the human. Moreover, the pursuit of human needs, wants, and desires have led to the forced migrations of people, dispossession, genocide, anti-Black violence, and environmental catastrophe, all of which are being exacerbated by and continue to create the division between the human and the non-human, those who are human and those who are not, and between those who have the resources to withstand human-made catastrophes. Consequently, even as the future of the humanities teaching is founded on the study of a now more vexed understanding of this concept, the future of teaching the humanities needs to acknowledge that many of our students are themselves quite anxious about the future. The grim recognition that the future is precarious and indeed not promised to all. We have all heard from various news sources that Gen Zers, traditionally aged undergraduate students, are an anxious generation. For some of them, the future is less of a place of hope than of fear, and things only seem to be getting worse. I bring up this not to reify generalizations about a particularly constructed demographic, nor to suggest that our students' concerns are radically different from our own. But I mention Gen Zers here to suggest that, as we all know, and everyone in this room I'm sure is committed to, meeting our students where they are, which of course is also meeting us where we are. And one of the things that premodern critical race studies does, as we all know, is it teaches us and it helps our students engage with how we got here today. In one of my contributions to Throughlines, I offer suggestions for how to teach epic romance, early modern epic romance, but also more particularly Edmund Spenser's Fairy Queen. Epics, and there's a real classicist here, so you'll probably sort of, say this is such a bald definition. Epics, traditionally understood as significantly entwining projects of nation building and empire building, are useful texts for engaging students and asking them to examine how nations and empires want to see and imagine themselves. And when epics employ allegory, as Spenser's epic most certainly does, they allow students to see race-making happen on the spot. When I teach book 1 of the Fairy Queen on the Night of Holiness, I want students to pay attention to how Spenser situates both virtues and vices into bodies. For example, Muslim-coded figures in book 1 are no more than fleshy embodiments of doubleness, faithlessness, lawlessness, and joylessness. Unlike the white European heroes in the poem, they are static. They do not move. They do not change. In fact, the allegory necessitates that these figures do not become other than what they are essentialized to be. Allegory, like race, requires essentializing, and the fictional equation between name and concept and particular bodily features. And when it comes to Muslim coded figures in the Fairy Queen, the poem asks us, or the poem makes it clear that violence against them is justified, in telling readers to understand duessa, sans foi, sans loy, sans joy, as nothing more than their name signifies. It becomes clear that these heroes are not killing characters, but they are killing non-human concepts. We see the allegorical reduction to concept not only in Spencer's use of Muslim-coded figures, but also in his uses of fairness and blackness. Shout out Kim Hall, of course. In my contribution, I also draw attention to Red Cross Knight, his encounter with the 7 deadly sins in the House of Pride. Here's the poem's description of lustful lechery. Upon a bearded goat, whose rugged hair and wally eyes, the sign of jealousy, was like the person's self whom he did bear, who rough and black and filthy did appear, unseemly man to please fair ladies' eyes. Yet he of ladies oft was loved dear, when fairer faces were bid standing by. Oh, who does know the bent of women's fantasy? On top of, and putting aside Spencer's obvious anxieties about women's sexuality, and particularly what seems to be white women looking at blackness and getting hot and bothered, lechery is a black man riding a goat who resembles the black man that rides on him. The stanza blurs the distinction between black man and animal. Additionally, the poem inspires us. It actually insists us to visualize lechery as rough, black, and filthy. And it sets lechery and this black figure in opposition and as unsuitable to fair ladies' eyes. When it comes to vice, to this vice, one that is supposed to be shunned by the white Protestant Christian reader, Spencer makes his reader see a black man. Here and elsewhere, Spencer's allegory teaches readers how to read the bodies they encounter in the poem. It names the bodies. If you would see you might not have seen lechery and said, that's lechery, but the poem says that is lechery. And similar readings of these bodies, of the bodies that Spencer calls into being and imagined and wrote down, of course, have continued to stick to black and Muslim bodies to this day. Of course, what I want students to see is that this is a fiction, and that all, like the fictions of race today, they can be analyzed, critiqued, and be understood as allegorical, as trying to make concepts stick, even as we should try to make them unstick.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I want to start first by thanking Ruben and Ayana for inviting me to be part of this community. I always feel in this group a little bit like an interloper because I really study, like for these people, what's like late topics. I specialize, I'm a historian of 18th and 19th century African-American and African diaspora history. And it's funny because among historians who study the Americas, when I'm with the historians, I'm like studying the early stuff, and then when I'm hanging out with y'all, they're like, yeah, well, But it's an extraordinary group of people that I've had the opportunity to interact with since you all have invited me to come play with you. So I want to thank you for that. And Ayana, if you are at home watching, I just want to say to you that we miss you and we love you and we are just sending all of our best healing energy towards you. When we were invited to participate on this panel, Ruben gave us the option of preparing remarks or, speaking more freely. And I decided to do something that I think I literally have never done before, which is that I decided I just wanted to speak from my heart on this topic. And now, going last, it was funny because when I was walking over here, I was thinking, oh, I hope he doesn't ask me to go first, and now I'm thinking, oh no, I can't believe I have to go last because, after listening to my colleagues and their extraordinary remarks, I'm thinking, maybe speaking from the heart wasn't the way to go. But the reason I wanted to is because for me, honestly, right now, when I sort of think about how I feel and what I reflect upon relative to the current state of the humanities and the future of the humanities, I actually find myself coming much more from a heart place than I am coming from an intellectual place. And by that, what I mean is that there are really two things that I'm realizing are actually bothering me about what's happening in the humanities right now on a very personal level, like in a way that I actually really care about. And of course, it's partly because this is my intellectual passion, right? But it's also because I actually just really care about this, like on a personal level. And so I wanted to share a couple of those things and take just a minute to kind of provide context about them in hopes that maybe they are ideas either tonight or just kind of going forward, as we think about the future of the humanities and how we revise the humanities, that maybe some of these ideas will play on our consciousness and in our hearts. The first is that I actually I'm just gonna be honest, I'm a little worried. Not just about what's happening relative to the humanities in higher education, I'm actually worried about what we're doing in higher education more generally. As I was writing my syllabi for this semester, I always kind of write my first lecture in my head, as I'm writing my syllabus. And for years when I first started teaching, I would be like, this is my second year, as a professor, and this is my whatever. And, I don't do that anymore because it's no longer flattering to me. But as I'm preparing my syllabi, I still think about it. And I realized this is actually now my 25th year as a professor. And I am a little worried about what's happening relative, again, largely around the humanities, but about higher education more generally. And I think I'm thinking about this on a really personal level because I have three what I call nibblings. I have two nieces and a nephew. And my oldest niece is a senior in college. My nephew is a sophomore. And my youngest niece is applying to college right now. So if any of you out there are parents, either, of young children, what you're probably immediately thinking is, oh my God, there was a moment in which there were three of them under the age of 5. And yes, that is in fact true. Fortunately, they were my sisters. But, I have sort of helped raise them along the way, and I think a lot about what their experience is as a college student. And I don't want to be one of those kind of cranky old ladies who's like, when I was in college, but I do feel like when I was in college, I feel like I felt free to enter the institution and take classes on whatever I found interesting. I would go the first week and I'd be shopping around for classes, I'm gonna go sit in on this course on the nature of the universe, even though I think at the time I thought it was gonna be a political science major. But I'm interested in the planets and the solar system. I'm just gonna go sit on that class. I'm kind of interested in the environment. I'm gonna go sit in on this civil engineering class on environmental studies. I'm just gonna go and explore ideas. And I wasn't even at sort of a classic, small liberal arts college, but I felt like I had that freedom. And I think to me, that is where the humanities really makes a contribution, right? That students come into our classes and we open their minds to ideas, right? We teach them how to be critical thinkers. We teach them what it means to be human and what it means to reflect on the human experience, right? We teach them and we strive to teach them who they are, what it means to be a person on this planet, what type of a society we want to create, what kind of a world we want to live in, right? But when students, I feel like students today now enter the university feeling like, what's my major gonna be? What am I doing with the rest of my life? What's my career gonna be? What's gonna happen when I go to college? What's gonna happen to me? What am I gonna do, right? They like enter into it not with a spirit of curiosity and excitement, right? They enter into it with a sense of like terror and panic, right? About, I have to figure out walking through the door, what my major is gonna be, what I'm doing for the rest of my life, what my career is gonna be, right? And what the trajectory of my entire life experience is gonna be. At 17, like, what are we doing? And I feel like, so my point is that I think as much as we need to talk about what we want the future of the humanities to look like, we need to have that conversation in the context of what we want the university to be and to do, right? What do we want the nature of higher education to be and to do? What do we want our students' experience to be? What kinds of, energy and enthusiasm do we want them to have when they come through the doors of the institution so that they can enter our classrooms, right, and open themselves up to what the humanities has to offer? In ways that I worry they don't right now. And I feel like we kind of got to like pump the brakes, right, on the direction it's going, unless we kind of want it to be hopelessly lost. I don't want to be pessimistic in this regard, but I'm saying it in this way because I want us to take it seriously. The other thing I'll just say really quickly is that the other thing that I worry about, and this again for me comes from a very personal place, I don't know how many of you in the room are historians, but in the historical discipline right now, and this for me connects back to what you were saying at the beginning, Ruben, about critical race, studies and the backlash against it. In the historical discipline right now, there is a trend and a movement around presentism, right? And that you can't really be an authentic historian if you are thinking about the relationship between the past and the present. Right? We're only supposed to think about the past in its historical context, right? In that little bubble, and we're not supposed to think about, and for me as a historian, I'm like, well, what's the point of talking about this then? You know what I mean? Then what are we doing? But to me, that is part, right, of a particular kind of backlash that does not want us actually critically thinking about what is the relationship between what has happened in the past and what's happening right now. And I think that in the humanities, we are positioned, right, to be able to push back against that silencing that I think is happening. It's part of the reason why one of the things that I offered for this program was a syllabus that I've been working on it's a class called From Slavery to Mass Incarceration that's about the long history of policing. That thinks about how modern day policing has its origins in the nation's past. But I think we actually have to push back against that by going out of our way. And I think the example, because I work on Haiti, so I think that the example that you offered, right, about the backlash against Haitian migrants, I think is a really good example of this too. I think in our classrooms, like every single day, we have to go out of our way to make meaningful connections, not just because it educates the students, right? And we're trying to meet them where they are, which is important, but also because this is the way that we create a new society going forward, right? Like if we want to be better, we have to be willing to be self-reflective. And I think the way that we do that is by making those connections and kind of pushing back on the efforts to silence us.
Thank you, Leslie, and thank you all. As you can see, I'm incredibly lucky to be able to work alongside individuals like this who are contributing to Throughlines. And the syllabus that Leslie mentioned is on throughlines.org if you want to check it out. Free, accessible. So please visit our site. You're going to keep hearing me say that tonight. Leslie, in some ways you anticipated my first question, and it's based on something that that Dennis mentioned, and I think all four of you were incredibly rich in thinking through the legacy, right, of as Ian said, the old humanities, and thinking about how it's been filtered over time and what the interventions are that you can make as scholars, and specifically, I'll just be transparent here, right? To quote Indira Karimchetti, I think all of us have a surplus of visibility when it comes to race, right? So what your position is, with in front of a classroom, in broaching these conversations, right, regarding race and the material. But Dennis, you mentioned, we do need to meet students where they are, and I think Leslie articulated that, I think, beautifully in terms of how we can think about it. But you also said, and then having them meet us where we are. And so I'd like you all for a little bit to maybe reflect on that and to think about, like, where do you see us? Where are we? What is the state, not just of the field, but more importantly, like in your classrooms, how do you make that legible for your students to kind of think about, this is the conversation you're entering into. We've got a lot of baggage, right? But how do we unpack that baggage, and how do we go about showing them and having them meet us where we are?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you said you wanted Dennis to comment on that one, but that's something for all of us. Oh, okay. Donnell, you look like you have brilliance to share. You got, like, you're keyed up over there with your microphone.
No.
Okay.
I mean, I guess I'll just say a few words. No, I mean, because this is mainly prompted by Leslie's remarks just now, but also goes to the heart of something that Ruben had touched on in framing tonight's event. So where I find my students these days is in this state of suspension when it comes to the question of, like, how to exercise judgment. Like how to, like, engage in genuinely critical work. And so let me give a sort of illustration of this by talking about something that very recently happened on campus. So last week, we hosted a visiting scholar who came to the history department to give a talk. And this scholar was very unapologetic about their commitment to a form of historical judgment, right? There were these people. They were in the past. They did really bad stuff. We're not gonna, like, minimize this, or trivialize it. Like, they did bad things, right? As part of the setup for this history department series, there is usually a faculty respondent who, like, gives a short overview of the paper and then sort of sets out some lines of inquiry for everyone in attendance. And the faculty respondent, who was a colleague in the history department, gave what I thought was a remarkable and honestly kind of staggering response, in which he called into question the very justification for exercising judgment about bad things people have done in history. He was like, how, you have all heard this, some version of this. How can we judge these people? They lived in this past so very long ago, like blah, blah. And would we, now this is the gravamen of my comment now, would we appreciate being judged by the future? To which our invited scholar and I, we looked at each other, because we've had these conversations in the past. And I was like, I hope to God that I am judged to hell and back by the future. Like, I hope that I am a subject of their judgment. But I mean, this is now where, but this is now where we get to, like, an issue that comes up in conversations, like, with students who are looking for models and structures within which to practice judgment. If you look now at the configuration of the 21st century university in its Euro-American incarnation, and specifically in its American incarnation, you will see that more often than not, there is a deadening of the facility to engage in judgment. I mean, this occurred in the spring, and all of last year in connection with student protests. It's occurring now. Like, any time that students are encouraged to participate in a process that might conduce to actual judgment, that judgment is held up at the moment at which it begins to engage quite substantively with real life events, right? So even when they are told, okay, you might be able to judge something that occurred, the key is you can't exercise that practice of discernment in the present. And what I'm trying to convey to these students in my teaching is that they should exercise practices of discernment, especially, but not only when it comes to things like racial violence. Like what are we doing if we're not opening up a space for them to engage in the intellectually edifying work that can also translate into a real-time civic reorientation? Like, I fail to see how the university can deliver on its promise if it's not doing that. And yet, there are very powerful structural incentives against doing this. And so where I meet my students now is at a place of seeing them reckon with the challenges associated with that. And at the same time, trying to hold out for them the promise that if they commit to this, then one day, maybe, we will all be in a more emancipatorily and epistemologically open place. But I mean, this is where we get into the talk of potentially selling them on like a false optimism, because for the reasons Leslie enumerated, I too am very concerned, and like I'm not even sure that I have like all that much faith in the structure of the university in its current form anymore. So I'm going to leave it at that on that pessimistic note. I'm going to pass it to my colleagues.
One thing that I do much more than I did when I was a younger assistant professor. I've been tenured for quite a while now, but which comes with tenure comes some privilege, of course, is actually being much more transparent about the fact that I am a researcher as well as a teacher. And by that, I'm just saying, like, I have a personal intellectual investment in some of these questions, right? And of course, like, you know, some of these personal intellectual investments are not that far from some things you might associate with all of this, right, that you see before you. You know, and I think when I've sort of said that I'm grappling with these questions myself, right? I am interested in these things, right? And I don't try to make my own interest, you know, I don't want to put them in there as a way to over-direct the conversation or limit the conversation, but when something appears in the text or in the point of the conversation, I sort of, you know, sometimes it's a little bit exaggerated, but I will like sort of perk up and, you know, show a little more excitement and example, like, oh, wow, this is really exciting to me because ... right? And I think, you know, that, I mean, so I don't mind them knowing that I am personally invested in these things, right? And of course, I think I have some you know, institutional safety nets that allow me to do that, you know, as long as those still exist for some people, right? But I think, you know, there's a way that, you know, our own passion, our own investments to the students can inspire them to be invested in whatever, hopefully good things, but to become invested for themselves in the things that inspire them, and that there is no, it's not a bad thing to sort of say, well, I'm sort of part of my investment in looking at lechery is the fact that there is a long history of black men being over-sexualized, right? And sort of being only equated as being a sexual predator, right? And like they will sort of say, well, yeah, of course, right? Not of course, some of them it'll be news to, but I think for a lot of them, like, oh yeah, oh yeah, right? And this is not disconnected from that. So. These are my research interests. These are my investments. Hopefully you will develop your own, and they might intersect, they might not, but there they are.
I think I would probably like say something similar to what I said before, but like remix it a little bit. In that, like, you know, what I feel like I try to do in the classroom, and this is actually something I have done really since my earliest years of teaching, is to try to incorporate at least into every single class one thing. And I often try to bring as much as I can, but try to incorporate at least one thing that will connect whatever the topic is to something that they can relate to in contemporary society. And like I said, I actually originally started doing it for the purpose of what we said, right? Which is to help them bridge, right, the gap between their lived experience in the 21st, you know, when I first started, the late 20th, but, you know, the 21st century to what I'm talking about in the 18th or 19th century. It can be very difficult, right, to make kind of a meaningful connection, to relate to the people and the situations that we're talking about. And so, you know, and I still do this, like I would create like a soundtrack for every class, you know, and I would, like I'd start every class with music that I felt like contemporary music that I felt like riffed on whatever the topic was that I was talking about. Sometimes I would bring in a current event and kind of kick off the class with that and then loop it back into the conversation somewhere else in the lecture. So that was kind of my strategy for a long time. But like I said, now I feel like I'm actually doing it for that reason, and also because I'm fighting back against the presentists. You know what I mean? Like, also because I feel like we do need to go out of our way to reinforce the idea that we see the value in understanding the past so that we can be better going forward, right? That we can actually learn a lesson from that, right? And to see the extent to which things are kind of playing out. I just have to say quickly, Donnell, because when you made the comment about the person who visited your campus and the response to it, it reminds me of like something that comes up almost every time I teach the intro course, like the survey, Introduction to African American History. At some point, usually about halfway through the semester, I have a student who's like, I just can't believe that people did that, you know? Like, I can't believe they held people in slavery and that, you know, they put them in shackles and, you know, whatever it is. There's like something in particular that I'm lecturing about that they just sort of viscerally respond to and just are like, I can't believe that people did that. And whenever that happens, I always stop and say, what is it that you think we are doing right now that 100 years, that we just take for granted? It's a thing, right? That people, you might feel a little bit uncomfortable with it, right? Or you don't necessarily love it. You kind of know on some level it's not great, but we do it, right? And 100 years from now, people are gonna be like, oh my God, I can't believe people did that, right? And I actually stop the class and make them tell me things, right? Oftentimes it's things about the environment and you know what I mean, all the things that would naturally occur. But I kind of do that, right, as a way of kind of trying to say, like, yeah, you know what I mean? We are doing things right now that people would find completely abhorrent. Hopefully, I hope they will, right? 100 years from now, they will find completely abhorrent, and yet we find it, right, as part of our daily experience. And I do that not because necessarily I want them to have sympathy for the enslavers, right? But I want them to understand, right, how easy it is in society today to live with and accept horrific things, you know, and yet, you know, and still live our lives and, you know, go to school and come home and stop at Chipotle on the way back and, you know what I mean, whatever, you know, that we still live our daily experience even though these horrific things are happening around us.
Not really, only because I think everybody has said a version of what I mean, I think we're sharing a similar conviction about our commitment to students, our commitment to this connection between teaching, writing, speaking, reading, and what those things have to do with who we are now and who we can be.
Mm-hmm.
And so it would simply be to reiterate most of that. Mm-hmm. What I might add, if anything, is, and I think Leslie did a bit of that just now, is if we all share that vision, which of course I think is the thing that makes us, if I may speak, well, for myself, makes me get out of bed each morning and be grateful for the opportunity to do what I do these many decades, and I'm still excited at this point in time to do it. What I would say is, it's the how then. So we're committed to it, and so the more sort of, you know, these are sort of lofty, exciting, passionate ideas. Now the more sort of gritty day to day, how do we do this? The more sort of, you know, perhaps not as exciting about method. So you just talked about what you do. You pause, you stop, you have them engage and reflect in the moment. Mm-hmm. And so if I might add a little bit to the how we do it, is I do try to, of course, because I see race as integrated in everything we do and everything that we learn, because race is part of the human condition as we have constructed it, right, in the West, certainly, then it's not as if we can separate it out and have a class on race or, you know, just a text or something of this kind. It's there. The question is, how do we see it and how do we access it at some important moment? But still, certainly as a black person going into a classroom to teach and to ask students to read and see these things, there is always the possibility, I'm not sure if my colleagues here share that, that, oh, it's the black guy, so obviously he's gonna see the black thing. Black guy has the black agenda, whatever that is, you know, and I don't have an agenda, but you know, yeah, I'm supposed to have one. And so one of the things that I've done in my teaching is, unless it's a course like a race theory course where everybody knows that they're coming to the race, it's sort of obvious, right? But in the other courses, I never really start with with a text. The text may have racial concerns, but I don't talk about that. What I do is I talk about method first. And by method, I mean just how do we read? So for example, right now, I'm teaching, it's an introductory course, a requirement for English majors, and it's a course called British Literature, the 1800s. Right, it's not very obvious kind of course. You know, everybody has taught some version of that, I guess. And so I said, okay, first day, we're gonna do that, but we're also gonna do a little beyond that, and here's a reason why, because we need to ask ourselves, well, what are the consequences of reading that literature? What happened? And of course, I'm gonna go into the Harlem Renaissance. That's what I really wanna do. But, so that's a consequence. So I say that up front so that if anybody wants to leave their Harlem Renaissance, they think, Harlem, something black, not for me, I'm gone, right? Whatever. But I say that. And then we start reading, and, you know, I start with Petrarch, you know, not English, but Italian, you know, obvious reasons why. Then we do Wyatt and so on. And I'm not talking about race, at least not explicitly. There are racial elements there, but we're gonna get to that in week 4 or 5, let's say, right? But what I do is I talk about how do we read the texts? Because if we're gonna study that literature, the real question for me then is not just, here is the text, here's some content, it's how we read. So Dennis, for example, gave an example of how to read Spencer, right? How do we read that text? And so we talk about little things. Word choice, where words are situated, the use of sibilants, the use of, you know, assonance, internal structure, repetition, why that matters, etc. All the things that we all do, right? And so on. And you build that vocabulary, but you build that attentiveness to language and how language works. So that when we land on a text like, say, Hamlet, and then you say, okay, now let's read Hamlet, and how do we read these lines? Do we see something here, if using the same methods, that can be read in racial terms? My hope is, and in practice it has turned out to be the case, students are less resistant, even if they were inclined to be, but it also generates more trust, because they're now saying, well, we've been doing this all along, and I now, you know, and they've got some skills now, right? I know how to read and do this kind of thing. And so you create an environment of trust where rather than students feeling that something has been imposed on them by the black guy, they can say, okay, the text as evidence, and that's what I always underscore. How do we read text as evidence? Not as feeling. I'm not a feeling guy, and right? It's no, because too often students come to literature and want to feel, I just come here for my feelings, and which is fine. Don't get me, you know, and that's fine. There's room for that too. But my objection always is, they raise questions then, and about the text and about the teacher that they'd never raise to a teacher of physics. They wouldn't do that, because some of physics has standards. And so I push back against that whole feeling thing, just because I want them to have a similar respect for this work that I love, that I take seriously, that I want them to engage in and love too, as evidence. And so for me, sort of thinking about how we get students to read, how we enable them to read, is as important as the sort of long-term, lofty goals, for example, that I spoke about here, thinking about democracy, right? We can get there, but first we have to give them the tools to get there.
Thank you, Ian. I deeply appreciate your attentiveness to method here, right? Because it's something that's not intuitive, I think, for many of us, and that's something we recognized. We would often get the question, how I want to incorporate this into the classroom, but like the how was a problem, right? And luckily, we have the expertise of individuals like this who afford that. I'm going to go off script a little bit. My intention was to show some clips and then have them pause and comment on them, but I do want to invite you into the conversation. So what I want to do is show the clips, and then we can open it up for discussion, if that's all right. So give you some food for thought. You can see what they're presenting, at least a snapshot of what they're presenting on Throughlines, and then we can open it up to the audience. So.
A few years ago, I was teaching a large lecture class on a survey of early British literature. And the class was unusually animated, willing to talk about the most challenging topics. They were highly engaged. And then we got to Othello, and there was silence. At first I thought maybe they haven't read the play, so I asked. And 150 heads said, no, we have read it. And I was like, why are you all quiet? And I realized at that moment that these students had never been in a space where they could talk about race openly.
But I wanted students to understand and have compassion.
Why should Shakespeare matter to us?
That Europe would be alone in the period is frankly laughable.
Basically, talking about the past is the point, is a historical point, the starting point of healing.
These are skills that they will take with them for the rest of their lives.
Specifics here.
PCRS, as I see it, has enormous potency as an ethical summons to intellectual history of the most rigorous kind. Part of what I see as important about that ethical summons for classicists is that normally the field has understood its own intellectual history to orbit the very specific historical identities of these individual scholars who, more often than not, are cleaved artificially from the context of knowledge production in which they operate. The genius of PCRS is that it has really encouraged folks to think in the first instance about collectivities of knowledge and knowledge formation, and also to think about structures of racial formation that pervade and define the texts and non-textual materials from premodernities that we encounter without explicit or primary reference to any one scholar or any one unit of scholars.
Racial ideology, I argue, is implicated in one of the most familiar yet recognizable cliches: don't judge a book by its cover. The Renaissance recognized this idea in the Silenus, a statuette that appears odd and unattractive on the outside, but when opened is quite beautiful inside. The figure memorably turns up in Plato's Symposium to describe the unsociable but brilliant Socrates. The lesson to be drawn insisted that internal qualities like human intelligence and wisdom were to take precedence over mere surface things. The statement, "Don't judge a book by its cover," encourages us to refrain from engaging in superficial thinking, drawing hasty conclusions, and formulating judgments based on surface appearance. In the context of teaching writing and rhetoric, we might dismiss the sentiment as trite, but its life application tells a very different story.
When teaching early modern text, I make it clear in the classroom that the Reformation was more than just about Catholic-Protestant conflict. Reading selection from John Fox's Book of Martyrs helps students understand the stakes and breadth of religious conversion in the period. While not usually read as a text that has anything to do with race, Book of Martyrs demonstrates that Fox is aware of the Spanish concept of limpieza de sangre, or blood purity, which rendered Christians with Jewish or Moorish blood as not fully or really Christians. The belief explicitly links religion to race. Fox's book also contains stories of Turks persecuting Christians and of Jews both converting and not converting to Christianity. On the question of Jews converting to Christianity, Fox seems quite ambivalent. Jews converting or not converting to Christianity concerned many early Reformation thinkers, and the refusal to convert was taken as a sign that they can't. That is, that there is something about their very being that makes it impossible for them to accept Christianity as true. We see this clearly in Martin Luther's On the Jews and Their Lies from 1534, a Reformation text that was not widely circulated in the 16th century and probably unknown in early modern England, but that made a resurgence in Nazi Germany.
On April 6, 1712, approximately 24 enslaved Africans, men and women, gathered in the heart of New York City at about 2 a.m., armed with a variety of weapons, including guns, axes, and knives. Likely enraged by English authorities' recent decision to pass a series of restrictive laws, these freedom seekers resolved to go to battle against slavery. In the early morning hours, the rebels set the city ablaze. During the ensuing hysteria, they ambushed and killed 9 white people and wounded 7 others. Interestingly, the rebels drew heavily on African cultural and spiritual practices during the rebellion. When preparing to launch the revolt, the conspirators turned to a known African spiritual leader, a conjure man known as Peter the Doctor, who rubbed a mysterious powder on their clothing to make them invincible against their enemies.
That's just a snapshot of some of the material before they get to some primary text. I do want to allow, just with the time left here, you to enter into the conversation. So if you have questions for any of our panelists, please raise your hand.
I have a question to kind of get at the heart of why we're all here today. I'm interested in your experience because all of you are expert educators, master teachers. The format of Throughlines, which we just saw some clips of, I wonder if you have thoughts about what you hoped other educators would receive when you sat down for those recordings, when you prepared for this, and if there was anything that surprised you about the process.
I'm not sure why I have this. That's a great question, actually. I think the truth is I was kind of hoping that, like, in a way, and I feel like it is, because I've already had people contact me who didn't even know that I was working on this, say, oh, I just saw your, thing, and oh, I've been watching the other ones, and we've been having an exchange. Like, what I was hoping is that it would kind of launch a conversation, among ourselves about what we actually do in the classroom, to reach students and to connect with them. And it was actually interesting because, I feel like my part in this really came about through a series of conversations with the staff, some of whom are here, who I had wonderful conversations and interactions with. But, they asked really good and interesting questions like, well, what do you do in the classroom? And, what strategies do you, like, they just started asking really, like, basic questions that I feel like we actually don't talk to each other enough about. Like, what do you actually do in your class? The truth is we're often reluctant to share syllabi with each other, which I'm not really sure why, but, like,
even when we do, we kind of like share syllabi, but we don't talk about like, what are we actually doing in the room, you know? And we often really like only get insight about that if we go to like peer review each other's classes, which I've started saying yes to all the time because I go and like they have cool stuff going on in their classes, and then I'm like, ooh, I'm gonna try that in my class, you know? But I feel like we don't actually just have just informal conversation. You know, we might have like a pedagogy workshop or something, but we don't just like sit and chat with each other about like, what do you actually do in your classes and how do you get students to connect to this concept or to connect to that concept? And so I just was like, I found the process really gratifying, you know what I mean? In the sense that like, it actually forced me to stop and pause and be like, what are some of the things that I've done in the classroom over the years that have actually been successful, you know? Maybe what are some things that I tried that I'm like, well, I'm not gonna do that one again, you know? But like, what are some of the things that I actually feel like help students connect to the material? And so, yeah, to me, that's what was exciting to me about this format, was that I felt like it was kind of an opportunity to like, for me to like share my little pebbles, you know what I mean, in terms of like what I have done, but I also find it like a really exciting resource in terms of like the strategies that other people use, you know? So I think that for me is like what I was hoping to get out of it, was that people would find my random little things helpful. And, you know, I was hoping that I would gain, you know, from the strategies that other folks use.
Well, I'll say two things. First is that I truly hate watching myself. and whenever I have made myself watch those clips of me on Throughlines, I flinch. But on a more serious note, it was important for me to participate in the project for reasons that I didn't even fully apprehend at the moment that I began contributing. What I see as so wonderful about what Ayana and Ruben and the entire Race Before Race community, ACMRS community have done is like build us up as experts, right? So like expertise is a currency. And for much of my career, I've like struggled with owning up to aspects of my own expertise. And I would imagine there are many folks in the room who would admit to some version of that sentiment. So it was important to have that expertise be enshrined in this particular way. And for that, I'll forever be grateful. The other aspect of this that has been on my mind recently has to do with an exchange on Blue Sky that I will now read. There was a colleague at another institution who circulated a link to Throughlines. And this was the reply they received from a classicist who has done work on race in antiquity. The classicist wrote, "It skews heavily to post-antiquity. Only one person I recognize from ancient, and he's a solid Romanist. Ha 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 ha." Now, they put the ha ha ha. I'm laughing at the solid Romanist, but you know, it's all right. At which point, the conversation continues. "Yes, that's fair," the original poster replied. "I think that's because of the project it came out of," to which this classicist then answered back, "Yeah, but it makes it less useful for some of the classrooms that need it most." Now, the reason I've chosen to treat you all to this Blue Sky exchange is that there's something about this exchange that seems to me symptomatic of a particular way of engaging with projects of this kind. And it is the dream that this enterprise will be some kind of totalizing enterprise. In other words, that it will fully and perfectly encompass the whole range of classrooms and sites of knowledge production for premodernity, right? This is a fiction. But what I would submit to this classicist next time I see them is that this totalizing fiction is born out of like a particular disciplinary neurosis, the idea that there has to be summoned into being and instated in the world, the explanation to trump all other explanations when it comes to the study of pre-modern race, or for that matter, any other construct of knowledge of which similar things can and have been said, right? I think though, and this is the final point I'll stress, that there is something unique about the racial indexing of this kind of comment that warrants further attention, right? So the idea that we cannot have a resource that might speak to the contingent and specific needs of classicists or ancient Mediterranean studies folks, because it is tilted in the direction of post-antiquity, is ultimately derivative of a construction of racial formation that bifurcates different aspects of the pre-modern experience. And that in itself is highly revealing, right? So I see these and other exchanges online as opportunities for learning. I mean, there are also gauges of the sort of uptake of Throughlines, but they also point to what a future for Throughlines can be, right? As a site for engaging in very productive conversations about the limits, the circumscribing protocols, the horizons of particular disciplines. This is what I think lends it its most enduring value.
I should be clear too that when I mention it's dynamic, it will continue to grow, it will continue to expand, and so that's the idea behind it. And I appreciate the candor all around. I mean, you can see like a great group of people. Ian doesn't know this because he's not on social media, but when we were promoting this, we have a great clip of Ian describing when he became Black, which just coincided with somebody suggesting that Kamala Harris had just turned Black. But he talks about the experience of coming from Jamaica, right? And he says, that's where when I came to the U.S. when I became Black, right? People identified me as such, and it was this really poignant moment that we recognized it. So we used that, as a kind of promo. The conversation surrounding that, Ian, is thousands of people now long, right? The comments section on that, and it's amazing. A lot of Jamaican-born individuals talking about their identities and experiences in the U.S. And so, in some ways, even it's like a subsector of what we're doing here, right? But it gives us space for those kinds of conversations. And so, despite the aim of Throughlines and what we're doing, I mean, I think our hope is also more expansive, right? And that sense of legibility for broader audiences, right, weighs into teaching. I had hoped, and time does not allow, right, and which is why I showed the clips in unison, but they all come to these great moments. I mean, 1 through 4 of arriving at weighs in, at thinking about specific texts, cliche of race through 12th Night, right, Dennis is looking at the Jew of Malta in this regard, and so Leslie has a great exercise where she would you rebel, right, with her students and kind of thinking about being in that position, and Danielle's just brilliant throughout and really interrogating, right? I mean, just much of what he spoke about in the opening comments here, right, about those legacies. So it's something that we are incredibly proud of because we are just incredibly lucky to be in conversation with this rich community. And so I'm glad that you were able to join us and get a snapshot of this. Please amplify this to broader crowds, as much as you can, and keep an eye on it. Like I said, it will keep growing, so you can come back again, and hopefully visit it often. Before I wrap up tonight, I do want to take a moment to thank deeply Leah Newsom, Sarah Moser, Em McDonough. They're behind the scenes always in this programming, but they are instrumental. Also, the ASU team in DC was incredible. So thank you all for helping us and getting us here. And then finally, please join me in thanking our panelists for making this. Thank you so much. For those at home, I hope you have a wonderful weekend. For those here, please enjoy some drinks and good company.
our drinks outside on the terrace. You can get to it from a door over here or a door over here. Wine and beer, sodas, waters, and everything. Food is on its way out. So enjoy. Have at it.